we've already had America stopping that military support and also, severing that intelligence sharing. And so I think it would be the same thing, really. They'd stop giving Ukraine arms and they would stop helping them in other ways. And obviously that would leave it to the Europeans to try and do more of the heavy lifting.
I'm joined today by Times Defence editor Larisa Brown. Thank you for talking to me today.
No problem.
It was recently announced that Marco Rubio would not be attending a very important meeting in London between America and key European figures, in which Starmer was hoping to bridge some of the gaps between Washington and Ukraine. Rubio cited logistical issues as the reason for cancelling, but the question in my mind is surely the White House must have known how this vague and sudden change of plans would lead to speculations. So what are your thoughts on what we should make of this?
Yes, I mean, they blamed scheduling issues, and as you said, and I think one of the suggestions that's been out there today is that actually the Americans had presented their sort of final offer to the Ukrainians on how they saw a peace deal going, and the Ukrainians have so far refused to sign that, and therefore Rubio and Witkoff decided not to attend those meetings today. And also, I suppose the fact that they're not here in London also sends a message to the Europeans, really, that says that actually their views don't really matter. They don't need to be heard at this stage in the game. And Witkoff instead is going to meet Putin again this week, apparently. And clearly, they think all the real talk is with Putin in Moscow, not here in London.
So do you think this is an early sign of America withdrawing? There's been mention that they would be stepping back, I think, unless there was enthusiasm on both sides, I think is how J.D. Vance put it.
Yes, and J.D. Vance has echoed comments by Trump previously just today. And Vance is saying that basically both countries have got a good deal in front of them, a fair deal, I think is how he described it. And now they need to agree to that. And yes, there's this looming threat that if Ukraine doesn't agree to this deal, then the Americans are going to pull out of the negotiations altogether. And clearly the wider concern there is that the Americans will then stop supporting Ukraine overall. So that they could stop supporting them from a military aid perspective, but also stop that intelligence sharing, and the Ukrainians will really suffer on the battlefield as a result without any of that American support. So really, Zelensky is in an impossible situation here because he's been presented with a plan that clearly would force Ukraine to give up a lot of things that it doesn't want to. But if he doesn't actually agree to this deal, then he's got the threat from America that it's going to pull out of the negotiations and stop helping altogether. So it's a pretty bleak choice ahead of the Zelensky.
How do you think America taking a step back, as they put it, would look like in terms of future support for Ukraine, you think?
I think it would. I think we've already had America stopping that military support and also severing that intelligence sharing, and so I think it would be the same thing, really. They'd stop giving Ukraine arms and they would stop helping them in other ways, and obviously that would leave it to the Europeans to try and do more of the heavy lifting. But in reality, the Europeans are actually really short of weapons at the moment, especially in the UK. We've given them a lot of our kit already. There isn't actually much left. The cupboards are pretty bare, which begs the question on how would we possibly be able to fill any void left by the Americans? Now, we might be able to help Ukraine for the short term, but any sort of longer term support that would enable Ukraine to start pushing back the Russians coming from the Europeans is going to be quite unrealistic, I think. And also, if you look at the situation on the battlefield today, the Ukrainians are continuing to lose territory. And yes, Russia's advance has slowed at the moment compared to how it was a couple of months ago, but they are still making slow but steady gains. And so that's with the Americans helping still. So imagine a situation where they haven't got that American support.
Do you think the coalition of the Willings defense fund that has been announced that the UK is looking to be a part of. How much does that compare to American aid, and what portion of that do you think would be given or be able to be available to Ukraine?
I mean, I'm not clear exactly what would go to Ukraine. I'm not sure anybody really knows the detail of what country would be willing to supply to Ukraine, in future years. I mean, the UK has said that it's giving Ukraine over four billion this year alone, and clearly Europeans have obviously given Ukraine a lot of lethal kit too, as well as aid support. But the thing with the American kit is that it's really considered the cream of the weapons. It's really the high tech, most advanced equipment that Ukraine really needs. So yes, there might be other countries across the world that are willing to supply Ukraine with weapons, but whether that's any good enough is another question. They really need some of the American stuff that they're getting. And then it's the whole question of the importance of the intelligence sharing as well. The Americans are needed for the Ukrainians to actually hit targets precisely. Without US intelligence and US targeting procedures, the Ukrainians would struggle to hit the right targets with the kit that they've been given.
JD Vance, in some of his statements of taking a step back, has said an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, I think it's a direct quote, has gone into trying to organize a peace arrangement between Russia and Ukraine. But it's only been being generous 2.5 months of negotiation so far. How long does this usually, a peace negotiation, you should take?
Well, Trump had said that, he initially said that he was going to solve it all within a matter of hours of becoming president. And then now there's a lot of talk about the fact we're coming up to this 100-day point when he's been in office for 100 days. He wants it all sorted out, and that would take us to the end of this month. So he's not got many days left. And I think they're sort of ramping up all of these discussions at the moment because they want it all signed, done, dusted, and then they can, move on with other America first policies. And so obviously this would be quite a short amount of time. The Ukrainians have said that they need a lot longer. So have the Russians. They've said they'd need a lot longer too. Although, the current briefing on what the US plan would be, seeing Ukraine give up its territory that's been taken by Russia, effectively freezing the conflict along the current lines as it exists today, not letting Ukraine have membership of NATO. It's quite hard to really see what Russia is losing from all of this. There has been not that much emphasis put on what Putin needs to give up. Trump hasn't been as forceful with Russia, telling Putin to come to the table as he has with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are basically left with this impossible choice, whereas Putin he could continue with the war, which he's doing all right with at the moment, but he also knows that the Americans are going to pull out, so it's probably only going to get better for him. Or he could agree to this peace deal, or actually also isn't that bad because he gets to keep all the territory he's got at the moment, have Crimea recognized by the Americans. And so really it seems like a bit of a win-win for Putin either way, which is extraordinary, extraordinary that we're in these times when a few months ago when Biden was in power, it was all about America and the Europeans giving the Ukrainians the strongest hand possible to go into negotiations. While now Ukraine is looking pretty weak.
And so do you think by extension Trump could look a little weak for not having certainly applied enough pressure to bring Russia to more reasonable terms?
I think everybody's just extremely nervous about what Trump does next. I think to him, he would be considered a strong leader if he's able to get some sort of peace deal over the line. But I'm sure if he doesn't get this over the line, he's going to have other people to blame for that. And either way, I'm sure he'll have some way of making this seem like he's the strong, sensible one, whereas everyone else is just failing to come to the peace terms. I mean, the Europeans have said quite cleverly over the last few weeks, they've been very supportive of Trump in terms of trying to, get the peace deal over the line and say, it's all about, it's Trump. Trump's done a good job so far. He needs to really get this, get a deal on the table. And clearly there's a lot of pressure on Trump, but what that sort of manifests itself as in terms of how Trump perceives his position, it remains to be seen, really.
Does it speak somewhat to a lack of experience, do you think, in the Trump administration, that they have considered the 80 days or so as a inordinate or was it sort of an unprecedented amount of diplomatic effort?
Yes, I mean, Trump's picked some quite extraordinary characters to be top of his team, really. I mean, people that aren't experienced in the same way that you'd have expected people in those positions to be. Um, I mean, Pete Hegseth himself, the US Defense Secretary, is coming under a lot of criticism at the moment over his, the apparent leaking of information or sending of information, sensitive, secret information over signal chats. And that obviously makes you question how responsible he is, really. And obviously there's been loads of other things that have come up concerning Trump's other team members. Clearly, they all are united on this idea that they want a peace deal over the line, that it can't go on. They don't want this forever war that some of them will have seen when they were serving in Afghanistan. They want an end to it all. They don't want billions of pounds of American dollars being spent anymore. And clearly they think they've got the mood of the American public behind them. They don't want this war to continue for years on end. Biden couldn't end it. And now Trump is seen as the only solution, really. But it's important to remember that there is another way that you could handle all of this. The way that the Ukrainians and the Europeans saw it is that you need to really ramp up support, and that actually previously the Ukrainians were given just enough weapons to keep the Russians back to some extent, but not enough weapons and support to actually win the war. And Trump could exert much more pressure on Putin than he is doing at the moment, and force him to agree a ceasefire and get some of that territory back. But instead, it's all working in Russia's favor instead of Ukraine's favor.
Yeah, this may be going over slightly the question I asked before, but you mentioned that Trump is seen as potentially the only solution by many Americans. How do you think they would respond to him walking away from talks?
I mean, I kind of feel like they would see that Trump's tried to get us, the way that the US administration frames it is that Trump will have tried the best that he possibly could have. And actually it's Zelensky's fault. I mean, the poor man, Zelensky's fault for not agreeing to the terms. I mean, it's going to be a really tricky few days, really, because the Ukrainians are going to have to really think about how they manage all of this, because they certainly don't want to be seen to be the ones that reject any proposal when Putin, is seen as the person that might be accepting it, because of course then the US administration would blame the Ukrainians instead of the Russians. So it's going to be really, there's going to be some really delicate discussions going on today in London about how they actually manage all of this going forward, and what are what is actually Ukraine prepared to give up? What is Putin prepared to give up? I've not seen anything that Putin is prepared to give up. And clearly Zelensky's trying to, play hardball in terms of saying, well, we're not giving up any land. It's all, it's Ukraine's land. So, something is going to have to give at some point. I think if there is going to be a deal, but many people would argue that Putin, the aggressor, is the one that should be giving something up.
Putin has said very recently that he would be interested in direct talks with Ukraine. What do you make of this? Is this a real potential for talks once Trump has exited the situation? Or is it just sort of another symbolic but empty gesture to try and show Russia's the cooperative one?
I think Putin's just playing a game. I think he's trying to sort of play into Trump's hands, really. Zelensky said that he would be happy to have these talks if there was a ceasefire, and then he would, go and have a discussion. But I think in reality, the Ukrainians know that Putin can't be trusted, and everybody that I've spoken to in Europe, Western officials, have said that they don't think Putin is actually willing to give up territory. He doesn't want an end to the war. He's not changed his objectives that he had when he first started this full-scale war against Ukraine. And any deal that actually materializes now will see Putin rearm and take further territory inside Ukraine in the future. And that's obviously what everyone is trying to stop, to ensure that if there is a peace deal, then there needs to be something in place to ensure that actually the rest of Ukraine is protected, and Putin can't do that. Now, obviously, that's part of the discussion today in London, but we're yet to really see a proper plan that shows what Europe and Britain would be doing on the ground in Ukraine to stop that happening.
Why do you think Trump is so unwilling then to put the necessary pressure on Putin to at least make some concessions?
Wow, it's a good question. I think that to some extent, Trump sees Putin as this sort of a bit of a, he's well, how would you describe it? He's quite, he's at the top of the table, top of the league. He's a big player, and Zelensky's not in the same league as Putin from Trump's eyes. Trump likes to talk about Putin as a friend, and he has this, that phone call with Putin before anyone knew about it, and didn't include Zelensky. And I think there's probably a lot of history as well behind it all, with former relationships with Zelensky before he became president. There's probably a lot more to it, and we can't really go into that all now, because there's lots of relationships as well between various administration figures and others, and I think it's very, very complicated. But I think ultimately it comes to the fact that clearly the Trump administration doesn't want to spend more money on helping Ukraine. It wants to bring an end to it, and he thinks that by somehow having this relationship with Putin, he will get to that end goal.
So what would a coalition of the willing really look like in Ukraine?
There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, over the last few weeks between the Brits and the French, who are going to lead that coalition of the willing force, and then also lots of other countries who have said that they would bring something to the table too. So what we know so far is that there would be some sort of reassurance or deterrence force that would be on the ground in Ukraine. Possibly you'd have troops stationed across Ukraine, but at key sites such as energy infrastructure, other critical national infrastructure, ports. They wouldn't be near the front line, because there are concerns in Europe that if you have those troops near the front line, that they could then get embroiled, far deeper into this conflict. And so they'd be further back, but they would be ensuring that if, Russia would not be able to advance from any points that it is at the moment. There'll be some sort of Air Force element, perhaps like there'll be some sort of patrols, making sure that the skies are safe and that people can start flying back to Kyiv, the capital. There would also be an element of American support, but we don't yet know what that is. That might be a US air defense system. It'd be some sort of backstop is what is being called. Now, that's obviously something that the British and the Europeans are really keen to get from the Americans, because they fear that just the Brits and the Europeans alone wouldn't actually be a strong enough deterrence to Putin. So they do need that American involvement, and that's seen as really, really crucial. And obviously, we don't really know then what the mission objectives would be in terms of what would they do. If their objective is to keep the peace, what if Russia fires on them? Then what do they do next? And there's some concern that we could put troops on the ground in Ukraine and then end up engaged in a conflict with Russia that then could get extremely messy. And as the US is taking a step back, we're getting ourselves, deeper into this war with no real end in sight. And I think that is a big concern, as, officials do talk in London today.
Somebody once said Putin's very good at taking red lines, chopping them up and turning them into slightly smaller pink lines. What could be a good way of how would the coalition of the willing ensure that those sorts of things weren't happening, where there was a accidental incursion, or, we need to take this village or this area because there was an attack on our side, so we need to create some security. What could be done in that sort of area?
Well, that's the big problem with Putin and his method of warfare. You know, he likes hybrid warfare. He likes blurring the lines. He could send little green men that he's saying aren't Russian, that then would make it really hard for us to fight back against those forces. He could send drones, but then make the drones fly into airspace that they shouldn't be in, but then sort of create a bit of confusion about whether that was deliberate or not. And so it's very easy to see a situation where Russia keeps pushing at Europe and Britain, but is able to do so in a way that the UK and Europe doesn't respond effectively until it's probably going to be too late. And so I think there is a lot of concern about what Putin would do next if there were European and British troops on the ground.
Larisa Brown, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.